First of all, I'm really happy to be here, and like everybody here, this is my first in-person conference in I don't know how long. Robin, thank you very much. Robin, thank you so much for making me part of this really exciting intellectual conversation. Robin has been sending me invitations for many years, and I have been persistently reluctant to come because I thought my work really didn't fit with what people here are interested in. Having seen the really articulate presentation by the first speaker, I'm feeling much more at home, and I'm going to actually kind of build up on some of his ideas. So thank you all for having me here. And Robin actually asked me to think about doing this work in 2019. That was before COVID. So much water has flown under the bridge, and many of the ideas that I'm going to present today have actually already recently been published. So if anybody is interested, I'm happy to share the article. It's published in Organization, and it's really the backbone of a book I'm writing on racial capitalism. So this may well be a kind of, a publicity stunt to get you all interested in this work. So let me start by saying that when I think of the master's tools, I'm seeing the master's tools basically played out or used within a much larger edifice of the master's making, an edifice which I would call capitalist modernity. And in this I draw very much from the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who I will constantly keep referring to as well. So I'm really trying to understand how race really plays out as part of the master's tools within capitalist modernity. And in order to do that, I'm really focusing on what is now increasingly being called racial capitalism or racialized capitalism. And I do want to make clear that I'm by no means a pioneer here, rather that I am joining a very vibrant conversation which has been taking place in a number of disciplines, and it is my goal to lure you all into deeper connections with this particular conversation. So that's my basic objective. So when I talk about racial capitalism, I'm really kind of looking at it at a much more broader, a macro level than the actual workplace or the corporate field, really. So this is a very macro enterprise, and I'm sure most of you here would agree with me that in the field of management and organizational studies, our tendency or our inclination towards understanding diversity, gender, race, etc., has been significantly lured by a more social psychology perspective. And while I'm not at all diminishing much of that, I do think I'm coming at it from a different vantage point, and I'm asking you all to kind of join me in that vantage point and look at things somewhat differently. So let me begin by actually talking a little bit about what I see as racial capitalism. So when I'm talking about racial capitalism, first of all, I'm looking at it as really a 500-year long process, perhaps even more, of systematically deriving socio-economic value from specific racial identity groups. And what I want to emphasize is socio-economic value. And I'm trying to really, along with other people who have these discussions, understand capitalism itself as a system of valuation, which is distinctly racialized. And so to adopt that or to take this seriously, I really have had to look at it more as a foundational to planetary-wide economic architectures. And so my discussion, even today, but in the book that I'm writing about, is not restricted to the US. And here I am going to quarrel with people who persist in looking at racial capitalism as very much a US thing, or at best, a Western European, a Western thing. But really, and then I'm going to jump to my point 4, the true inspiration for all my work has been someone who I came to far, far too late in my academic career, even though I have been wedded to understanding race since I was 28 years old. How is it that I and many others like me did not take seriously the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who remains, in my opinion, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century? But if Du Bois is to be taken seriously, his idea of the color line is not simple local or even national discrimination, but he really treats it very much as a global boundary. And so I'm going to try and do my best with sort of seeing where I take it with all of this. So many of us, I know, are familiar with W.B. Du Bois, and he does take an extremely macro position. One of the things I'm trying to do here is to also try and see how race inflects any kind of capitalist encounter. And to do that, I'm actually drawing on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who's also one of the major social theorists of the 20th century, but I'm really expanding and extending his own analysis. I'm not going to assume that everybody is too terribly familiar with his work, so let me just quickly take you through some of it. Bourdieu, whose main contribution, many people would argue, has been his own expansion of the notion of capital itself. So while most of us think of capital as something very material in terms of financial assets, property, mines, factories, etc., Bourdieu's greatest contribution has been in arguing that we either possess or do not possess certain kinds of intangible capital, which he calls symbolic capital. I'm just quickly, I've given the whole list there. Educational pedigrees, for instance. Clearly, we are in Harvard, the highest amount of symbolic capital. Harvard and Yale, Princeton, Columbia, all that. These are sort of forms of symbolic capital, very, very well recognized by those of us who went to humble places like the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Residential location, your neighborhood, everybody, we all recognize these things. Membership in exclusive clubs. He talks a lot about the ability to wear fashionable clothing, to be in style, so to speak. And he focuses enormously on an appreciation of fine foods, art, wine, etc. The mark of a connoisseur is actually bestowing on you a certain capital that you have that you can actually leverage. Fluency in certain languages, not all, such as French perhaps, but not Swahili or Nahuatl or even Urdu. Table manners, certain vocabulary, and of course the right accent. But the basic argument that Bourdieu is making, that many of these attributes constitute symbolic capital. They're intangibles, but they open one up to access to either networks or other opportunities which eventually result in material capital. Wonderful. But he missed something. This is what he missed. He completely missed this. So what Bourdieu missed is that whiteness constitutes a form of symbolic capital itself. So he was very focused on an analysis of the intangibles of a class, but he completely misses this. And so what I'm arguing that if you are to take Bourdieu seriously, there is actually an extra value. Remember, I'm really sort of focusing on this value thing, which is similar to Professor Ray's discussion of, Victor Ray's discussion of credentials, really. The extra value placed on whiteness in all economic transactions. And so as a result, eventually, whiteness becomes profitable, therefore serving as a form of capital in its own self. And eventually, of course, certain ethnicities and nationalities get associated with whiteness, thereby deriving a similar kind of capital-based benefit. And to a large extent, this is socially constructed, and of course, the case of the Irish is a very interesting one because the Irish were for a long time actually regarded as black. But eventually they were able to leverage whiteness in their favor, sort of. And so ultimately, of course, color then becomes a liability. And of course, here again, as a business professor, I can see this, almost on a, cost return benefits kind of thing, that whiteness is an asset and color becomes a liability. So the interesting thing here, though, this is not only a matter of mindset or simple prejudice. It becomes encoded in law in all kinds of capitalist regimes. I may focus more on the US, but this is actually true of many, many other countries. So we all know that since property relations is the foundational stone of capitalism, but property relations are not and have never been race neutral, but encoded in US law, of course, were restrictions on who could own private property. And the transformation, of course, as we all know, of non-white bodies, mainly black bodies and indigenous bodies, into property by law. And so the point here is that it's not just a matter of prejudice that it gets encoded. And again, taking a more planetary perspective, you also see the transformation of communal spaces in the Americas, in Australia, in South Asia, in Zimbabwe, for instance, into private property held thenceforward only by whites. So that's part of the argument here. Now, sticking with this legal thing, which I really find very fascinating, color then becomes a liability, and again is encoded not only in law, but also through a whole series of local, district, and Supreme Court judgments. I'm just going to mention a couple of them to alert us to what's going on. We're all familiar with the Plessy and Ferguson case, which we, of course, think of as legitimizing segregation. And it's really interesting to see what Homer Plessy, who was a light-complexioned black man, he referred to whiteness as the most valuable property that I have. Similarly, you go down the 20th century, you have a whole series of cases which are referred to as the race defamation cases, where you have a number of people, mostly belonging to ethnicities like Italian and Slavic, who were called black or who were accused of having a few drops of black blood, at which point they actually bring defamation cases against the people who make the accusations. What is fascinating is to see the number of times those cases were upheld, the plaintiffs were upheld, and enormous damages were awarded to the people who were called black or accused of being less white. And so my point here is there's a clear recognition in the entire legal system that whiteness is clearly of actual material value and non-whiteness is not. There are other, I don't have time to get into this, I can talk more. There's some fascinating marriage annulment cases where people claim to be defrauded because their spouses, mostly it's men actually, who claim that their wives had great-grandmothers who were black, even though they looked white, were not really white, and therefore had the marriages annulled, which was particularly easy with the anti-miscegenation laws in the South, of course. And then I want to draw your attention to this, this has become a favorite of mine. Have people here heard of the Andrew Hacker experiments? Okay, they're fascinating. Andrew Hacker is a political scientist who worked in the 90s with mostly white classes, privileged liberal white classes, and he was interested in kind of figuring out the extent to which his students had a realistic understanding of race relations. And while most of them, prior to the actual scenario he gives them, declared themselves to believe that racial equality had been nearly achieved or close to being achieved, they were then presented with this scenario. This was a scenario. Somehow, magically, overnight, your immediate family has been transformed from white to black. There's no going back. What kind of damages or compensation would you believe would be adequate for that situation? The average was $50 million in 1996. So this is mainly to kind of point out that we subconsciously know, and not even subconsciously, we acknowledge really, this is not some deep, dark secret that we are all hiding. And so my point really is that this whole value system is not only present, but it's really something that we all know about. And so when we in a system that practices economic interactions, of course it's going to influence everything. So in short, what you have then is the creation of what I call a deficiency discourse, a discourse that somehow labels certain people, non-white bodies, as deficient in intelligence, skill, creativity, ability to take risks, leadership, you name it. And it can kind of take different trajectories depending on which ethnic group or which racial group is being talked about. And so that deficiency discourse is what kind of influences and shapes major decision makers and making from the lowest level to the highest in the entire system of capitalist modernity. And I have a whole list of things I write about in the book, and I clearly don't have time to talk about it, but very, very briefly, it creates what are called split labor markets, which is something sociologists are aware of. A split labor market is created when qualified people of a particular racial or ethnic group are systematically undercompensated and presented with inequitable working conditions in comparison to white groups over long periods of time, where these patterns actually become sticky and cannot be explained by anything other than race. And the case actually of the Chinese Americans is one of the most illustrative of this. This leads to a whole question of colorism and the value placed on not just a white complexion, but also a Euro-American or European style of beauty, which my point here when it comes to capitalism is it also triggers an entire industry. The beauty industry, we all are familiar with whitening creams, lightening creams, hair straightening creams, the entire plastic surgery industry, particularly in the Far East, which is eye changing, nose changing, chin changing, I mean you name it, it's there. So this is part of how I believe that racialized capitalism begins to operate in many, many different sectors and industries. I go through many of them in the book. I really don't have time to get, I'm right now working on global commercial surrogacy, where you have mostly brown women's wombs rented out for 9 months with mostly white or people from the global north. Race becomes a geographically interesting thing sometimes, renting them out. And I'll end with my current interest in this whole question of cultural extraction. So if you permit me, I'll just conclude with that. What do I mean by cultural extraction? It's really the mining of cultural commodities, artifacts and practices of non-white people for a global market around the world. And so, I'm trying to make this again very global. And so what you have in cultural extraction is a systematic undervaluation of labor, skill, and technical expertise of the people who actually produce those goods, because there's a huge distinction between designers who are always situated in the West and tend to be mostly, if not always, white, and folk art or cottage industries, where you actually have people working with a heritage of a particular tradition of weaving or basket manufacturing, who simply don't reap the same advantages of global capitalism, and that raises all questions of intellectual property. The fashion industry, of course, is at the forefront of this, and so what you see there is, of course, clearly a white model wearing a Guatemalan huipil. The huipil actually takes something like 2 months to produce. The maximum anyone in Guatemala makes from a huipil is $40. It can be, this thing can go for as much as $360 in the boutique called Anthropology and various others of its ilk. So, it kind of illustrates the whole question of what is the value that was placed on the labor, the expertise, the skill, and the whole tradition of the huipil production versus how the benefits accrue to it being brand marketed. So these are some of the things I'm pursuing right now, and this is again not lost on many people. So you do have of late a whole set of contestations. So on the brighter side of things, there is contestation going on in cultural extraction. And so I've given a few examples. The Maasai have brought in lawsuits against Furstenberg, and the Navajo Nation actually won a huge settlement against urban outfitters. But it's complicated because, and this is why I'm going back to my original point, that the intellectual property regime of global capitalism is set up in such a way that it really does not benefit people from the global south, particularly people who are working within folk traditions of manufacturing and production, really. So where does that leave us? I just want to leave us with a few thoughts. First, obviously, hopefully I've made the point that race is as active a player as class in orchestrating the trajectory of global capitalism, or really the edifice within which the master's tools are used. Obviously, the end of slavery and an African American in the White House did not end. It's not enough to end racial capitalism, that it is much more, and this is, I think, my main point here, it's much more than crude stereotypes and cognitive errors about non-white people. It's a far more structural question, that the comforting myth of progress will not automatically end racial capitalism. And I'm happy to talk later more about it, the whole implication of liberal modernity in actually the larger project of racial capitalism. So I'll just leave us with these thoughts. Thank you.